1776 is remembered as the year America declared independence. But for the people living through it, the year did not feel like a clean national birth. It felt like a gamble made in public while an empire gathered its strength. At the beginning of the year, George Washington's army still surrounded Boston. It was short of powder, short of money, short of discipline, and short of time. The colonies had not yet declared independence. Many still hoped for reconciliation, or at least feared the consequences of breaking fully from the British crown. By July, the Continental Congress would approve words that changed history. That the United Colonies were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. But paper could not stop a British fleet. By late summer, New York Harbor would fill with ships. British and Hessian troops would land in overwhelming numbers. Washington's army would be defeated on Long Island, nearly trapped, pushed out of New York City, driven through New Jersey, and reduced by sickness, desertion, expiring enlistments, hunger, and despair. By December, the revolution seemed close to collapse. That is why 1776 is one of the most dramatic years in American history. It is the year the revolution found its voice, and the year that voice almost died in the cold. This is the story of Common Sense and Dorchester Heights, of Philadelphia and Independence Hall, of British sails on the horizon, of Brooklyn Hills, East River fog, a burning city, a hanged spy, and an army retreating through mud and winter. It is the story of a commander who made mistakes, lost cities, preserved an army, and at the edge of ruin chose to cross an icy river on Christmas night. Before the Declaration could become a nation, it had to survive 1776. And that survival did not come from one clean victory. It came from adaptation. Washington would learn that losing a city was not the same as losing the war. Congress would learn that declaring independence did not magically create money, soldiers, shoes, muskets, or international recognition. Ordinary civilians would learn that the revolution was not a distant argument among famous men. It moved through streets, farms, harbors, churches, taverns, and family loyalties. Some Americans cheered independence, some feared it. Some remained loyal to the crown, some tried to stay out of politics, and discovered that armies do not always permit neutrality. Enslaved people listened to patriot language about liberty while weighing British promises and local danger. Native nations watched the rebellion with their own strategic calculations, understanding that a patriot victory might mean even more pressure on their lands. That is the deeper story of 1776. It is not only the birth of a nation, it is the beginning of a long argument over what that nation would mean. In January 1776, a pamphlet appeared that changed the language of the Revolution. It was called Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, an English-born writer who had arrived in America only recently. Paine did not write like a cautious lawyer or a polished gentleman of Congress. He wrote like a man trying to tear the mask off an old belief. For years, many colonists had blamed Parliament, ministers, corruption, or bad policy. Paine aimed higher. He attacked monarchy itself. He argued that an island should not rule a continent, that hereditary kingship was absurd, and that reconciliation with Britain would only bring future danger. The force of common sense was not only its argument, it was its timing. The war had begun, but independence had not yet been declared. Boston was still occupied. Families had buried men from Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. The king had declared the colonies in rebellion. British authority and colonial loyalty could no longer comfortably live in the same sentence. Paine gave many readers permission to say what they had only begun to think. Independence, not merely rights within empire, not merely protest, not merely a return to the old arrangement if the king became kinder. Independence. The pamphlet spread rapidly. It was read in taverns, homes, workshops, and military camps. Some readers were electrified, others were horrified. Loyalists saw treason, moderates saw danger. But the center of gravity shifted. Paine's power came from plainness. He did not ask readers to admire clever legal distinctions. He asked them to look at the world as it had become. British troops had fired on colonists. The king had treated the resistance as rebellion. More soldiers were coming. Why cling to a parent country, Paine argued, that now behaved like an enemy? His opponents understood the danger of the argument. Once monarchy itself became the target, reconciliation looked less like peace and more like surrender to a system that had already failed. Common sense helped turn emotional outrage into political imagination. It made independence sound not only possible, but practical. In military camps, the pamphlet offered a different kind of weapon. Men who were cold, underpaid, and uncertain needed to know what their suffering was for. Paine gave them a vocabulary larger than Massachusetts, larger than taxes, larger than one king's ministers. He spoke of a continent, a new beginning, and a cause that could belong to ordinary people. Still, words alone could not free Boston. For that, Washington needed guns. The artillery that would change Boston had begun far to the north, at Fort Ticonderoga. In 1775, American forces had captured the fort and its cannon. But capturing guns was not the same as using them. The heavy artillery sat hundreds of miles from Boston, across winter roads, frozen rivers, rough tracks, and deep snow. Henry Knox believed they could be moved. Knox was a Boston bookseller turned artillery officer, large in body and imagination, with the kind of confidence logistics sometimes requires before reality agrees. Through the winter, he and his men hauled cannon from Ticonderoga toward Boston in what became one of the great logistical feats of the early war. Oxen strained, sledges broke, ice threatened to crack beneath the weight, snowstorms slowed the column, but the guns came south. Washington now had the instrument he needed. The key was Dorchester Heights, high ground overlooking Boston and the harbor. If American artillery appeared there, the British position would become dangerous. Ships in the harbor could be threatened. The town could no longer be held comfortably. On the night of March 4, 1776, American troops moved quietly onto the heights. They worked through the dark, building fortifications with remarkable speed. By morning, British officers looked up and saw works where none had stood the night before. General William Howe recognized the danger. He planned an assault, but weather interfered, and the memory of Bunker Hill hung over every calculation. Attacking fortified heights could be costly. Staying in Boston under American guns could be worse. The British chose evacuation. On March 17, 1776, British forces and many Loyalists left Boston by sea. For Americans, it was a tremendous morale victory. The town that had been occupied, punished, and watched for years was free of British troops. Washington had forced a British army to leave without a direct assault. But Boston was not the end of the war. It was the end of the first theater. The British would return with more ships, more soldiers, and a better target. New York. The evacuation also carried a quieter cost. Many Loyalists left with the British. Families who had remained loyal to the crown or feared Patriot punishment boarded ships and departed the town. For them, the Patriot victory was not liberation. It was exile. The revolution was already dividing neighbors into winners, losers, refugees, and suspects. Washington received praise and deserved much of it. Yet he understood the victory had not destroyed British power. Howe's army had left Boston intact. The Royal Navy remained the great fact of the war. Britain could choose another coast, another harbor, another campaign. Boston had been defended by geography and siege lines. New York would be different. Still, the victory mattered. It told Americans that the British could be forced to move. It gave Congress a success at the very moment independence was becoming thinkable. And it gave Washington confidence, perhaps more confidence than New York's geography would justify. The evacuation of Boston strengthened the Patriot cause, but it did not settle the central question. Were the colonies still fighting for rights within the British Empire, or were they fighting to become something else? In the spring and early summer of 1776, the pressure moved toward Philadelphia. The Continental Congress was not a single mind. Delegates carried different instructions, different fears, and different visions of the future. Some colonies moved quickly toward independence. Others hesitated. Some men worried that declaring independence too soon would divide the colonies, alienate moderates, and make reconciliation impossible. But reconciliation was becoming harder to imagine. British military preparations were massive. The king had rejected the idea that the colonies were merely petitioning subjects. Fighting had spread. Common sense had sharpened public debate. Local governments and conventions began telling their delegates to support independence. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution declaring that the United Colonies were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Congress did not vote immediately. The matter was too large. A committee was appointed to draft a formal declaration in case independence passed. The committee included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson, a young Virginian with a gift for political language, became the principal draftsman. The declaration would not be a military order. It would not create victory. It would explain a break that had already become unavoidable for many. It would tell the world why the colonies believed they were justified in separating from Britain. In late June and early July, Congress debated. It edited. It argued. It removed passages, softened some language, sharpened other claims, and balanced principle against politics. John Dickinson, one of the most important moderate voices, opposed declaring independence at that moment. He believed the colonies were not ready and that foreign alliances should be secured first. His caution was not cowardice. It was a serious fear that a declaration without military strength might become a death warrant. That fear was not unreasonable, but history was moving. Outside Congress, local politics accelerated the decision. Colonial assemblies, conventions, and committees debated instructions. Newspapers carried arguments for and against separation. Towns and counties weighed in. Independence was not simply pronounced from above. It rose through a messy political culture of petitions, meetings, pamphlets, rumors, sermons, and pressure from war itself. Foreign policy mattered too. If the colonies wanted help from France or other European powers, they could not merely present themselves as disgruntled British subjects. They needed to become a political entity capable of making alliances. Independence was therefore not only an emotional break, it was a diplomatic strategy. The men in Congress knew they were writing under military shadow. British forces were gathering for a campaign. If they waited for perfect security, they might never declare. If they declared too soon and were defeated, they might be remembered not as founders, but as rebels who misjudged the strength of an empire. On July 2, 1776, Congress approved independence. John Adams believed that date would be celebrated by future generations. 2 days later, on July 4th, Congress approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence. The words were extraordinary, but they were also dangerous. They accused King George III of repeated injuries and usurpations. They claimed that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. They declared that the colonies were free and independent states. In Philadelphia, the decision carried ceremony, but also fear. The men involved understood that if the revolution failed, their signatures and votes could be treated as treason. The declaration did not protect them. It exposed them. The document also carried contradictions from the beginning. It spoke of equality while slavery remained embedded in colonial society. It claimed universal principles while many people were excluded from political power. Enslaved people, free black Americans, women, native nations, loyalists, and the poor would all experience the revolution in ways the Declaration did not fully answer. But the Declaration gave the patriot cause a new identity. The war was no longer only a defense of rights, it was a war for independence. When the Declaration reached Washington's army in New York, it was read aloud to the troops. In the city, a statue of King George III was pulled down by a crowd. The symbolic break was powerful, but symbols do not hold a harbor. Even as Americans celebrated independence, British ships gathered off New York in numbers that made the scale of imperial power visible. Masts filled the water, troops arrived by the thousands. The British were not coming to debate the Declaration. They were coming to crush the rebellion. In New York, the Declaration did not erase uncertainty. The crowd that pulled down the statue of King George acted with symbolic force, but symbols can be dangerous when they outrun events. The lead from the statue was reportedly turned toward military use, a perfect image of the year. Royal authority melted down into bullets. For loyalists, the Declaration confirmed their worst fears. These were no longer protests by British subjects. This was separation. In areas where loyalist feeling remained strong, especially around New York, Staten Island, and parts of New Jersey, the arrival of British forces gave the king's supporters new confidence. For Washington, independence made defeat more serious. If his army failed now, there might be no easy return to negotiation. The declaration had raised the moral stakes and the personal danger for everyone attached to the cause. New York was a dangerous place to defend. Its geography favored the British Navy. Islands, rivers, bays, and channels allowed ships to move troops and supplies in ways Washington could not easily match. Manhattan, Long Island, Staten Island, the East River, the Hudson, and the harbor formed a maze of opportunity for an army backed by sea power. Washington understood that New York mattered. It was a major port, a political symbol, and a strategic gateway. But defending it required guessing where the British would strike and spreading limited troops across too much ground. General William Howe commanded the British Army. His brother, Admiral Richard Howe, commanded the naval force and also served as a peace commissioner. The Howe brothers hoped, at least at moments, that a combination of military pressure and negotiation might restore the empire. But after independence, the ground for compromise had shifted. British power gathered on Staten Island. Red-coated regulars, Hessian auxiliaries from German states, artillery, cavalry, sailors, transports, and warships made the expedition one of the largest imperial forces ever sent to North America. For Americans watching from New York, the sight was sobering. Independence had been declared in words. Now it had to face an army. Washington positioned troops on Long Island, especially on the Brooklyn Heights area, while also trying to hold Manhattan. His army included men from different colonies, with uneven training and uncertain experience. Some had fought around Boston. Many had not faced a major British assault. The British chose Long Island. In late August, they landed in force. The American army waiting for them was brave, but uneven. Some regiments had experience, others had enthusiasm in place of training. Officers argued over rank and responsibility. Supplies were inconsistent. Disease moved through camps. Men came from colonies that did not always trust one another. The idea of a united American army was still being built day by day. Washington had to defend too much with too little. If he abandoned New York without a fight, Congress and the public might see cowardice. If he tried to hold everything, he risked destruction. His instinct was to defend the city because politically, psychologically, and strategically it seemed too important to yield. Howe had the luxury of choosing the point of attack. That advantage shaped the campaign from the beginning. The battle that followed would be the largest of the war and one of Washington's greatest dangers. The Battle of Long Island began with a British plan that exploited American weakness. American forces guarded several passes through the Heights of Guam, a line of hills and wooded roads on Long Island. But the Jamaica Pass, farther east, was not adequately secured. British commanders found the opening. While part of the British force demonstrated against the Americans, a large flanking column moved through the Jamaica Pass during the night. By morning, American troops were in grave danger. They were hit from more than one direction, confused, overwhelmed, and pushed back toward Brooklyn. The fighting was fierce. Maryland troops made a famous stand near the old stone house, buying time for others to retreat. Men crossed marshes and open ground under fire. The Americans suffered heavily. Washington watched from Brooklyn Heights as parts of his army were battered. The defeat was severe, but the greater danger was still ahead. If Howe trapped the Americans against the East River, Washington could lose not merely a battle, but the army itself. For reasons still debated, Howe did not immediately storm the Brooklyn Heights defenses. He may have wished to avoid needless casualties. He may have believed siege operations would finish the job. He may have remembered the cost of Bunker Hill. Washington used the pause. On the night of August 29th into August 30th, he ordered an evacuation across the East River. John Glover's Marblehead men, sailors and fishermen skilled on the water, played a crucial role. Boats moved silently through darkness. Troops withdrew in secrecy. A fog helped conceal the final movement. By morning, the army was gone. The escape from Long Island was one of Washington's most important achievements. It did not erase defeat, but it preserved the army. And in the Revolution, preserving the army often mattered more than holding ground. Still, the campaign was only beginning. New York City itself was about to fall. The Long Island escape became one of those moments where weather, seamanship, discipline, and luck met. The army moved without fires, without drums, without the usual noise of a retreat. Glover's Marblehead men ferried regiment after regiment across dangerous water. A shift in wind helped. Fog covered the final movement. Men who had expected another day of battle found themselves slipping away from catastrophe. Washington was among the last to leave. It was not theatrical bravery for its own sake. Commanders often had to be seen sharing danger. If the army was to trust him through defeat, it had to believe he would not abandon it. Long Island taught a lesson that would define Washington's war. The Continental Army could lose territory, but if it survived, the Revolution survived with it. The British could win battles and still fail to end the war if Washington refused to give them the decisive destruction they needed. After Long Island, Washington faced a harsh question. Could Manhattan be held? The British Navy and Army had too many options. They could land, flank, threaten, and shift faster than Washington's forces could respond. The Americans withdrew from some positions, tried to hold others, and struggled to maintain order under pressure. In September, British forces landed at Kip's Bay on Manhattan. American troops panicked and fled. Washington, furious and humiliated, tried to rally men who would not stand. It was one of the moments when the Army's fragility became painfully visible. There was a brighter moment soon after at Harlem Heights, where American forces fought well and regained some confidence. But Harlem Heights did not reverse the strategic situation. New York City fell to the British. Then the city burned. A major fire swept through parts of New York in September. The cause remains debated, and both sides suspected the other. What mattered in the moment was the atmosphere it created: occupation, suspicion, ruins, and fear. Around the same time, an American officer named Nathan Hale was captured while attempting intelligence work behind British lines. He was executed as a spy. Later memory gave him famous final words about regretting that he had only one life to lose for his country. Whether the exact wording is certain or not, Hale became a symbol of sacrifice, but symbols again could not stop Howe. The British pressed north. Washington fought at White Plains in October, then continued withdrawing. Fort Washington on Manhattan became a disaster. In November, British forces captured the fort and took thousands of prisoners. Fort Lee, across the Hudson, soon had to be abandoned. The American position in the New York area collapsed. Washington's army retreated across New Jersey. Fort Washington was especially damaging. Thousands of men were captured, and prisoners in British hands often faced grim conditions. The loss struck at morale and exposed disagreement among American commanders over whether the fort should have been held. Washington had wanted to defend positions, but New York had punished that instinct repeatedly. The fall of the city also changed civilian life. British-occupied New York became a center of loyalist activity, military administration, prison ships, intelligence work, and wartime suffering. For the remainder of the war, the city would remain in British hands, a reminder that independence did not mean control. Washington now had to make a psychological transition. He could no longer fight like a commander, trying to defend every important place. He had to fight like a commander, trying to keep the cause alive. The retreat through New Jersey was the revolution at its lowest point. Washington's army was shrinking. Men were sick, hungry, barefoot, exhausted, and discouraged. Enlistments were expiring. Some soldiers had signed on for terms that would end with the year. Others deserted. Local support wavered. Loyalists gained confidence. Civilians watched the army pass and wondered whether the Patriot cause was already lost. British and Hessian forces pursued. Cornwallis pressed the chase. Town after town saw the Americans withdraw: Newark, New Brunswick, Princeton, Trenton. The names became markers in a long movement of loss. Washington did not look like a victorious founder. He looked like a commander trying to keep a collapsing army alive. Congress fled Philadelphia for a time, fearing the British might advance on the city. Thomas Paine, who had helped push the country toward independence with common sense, now wrote another kind of appeal. The American crisis opened with words meant for despair. These are the times that try men's souls. That sentence mattered because it named what people felt. The summer's confidence was gone. The declaration had not brought military success. It had made the stakes final. If the army dissolved, independence might become a memory of a failed rebellion. By December, Washington had crossed into Pennsylvania, beyond the Delaware River. The British and Hessian troops occupied positions in New Jersey, including Trenton. Many British commanders believed the campaign season was essentially ending. Winter would pause major operations. The rebellion seemed weak enough to wait out. Washington saw the same facts and reached a different conclusion. If he did nothing, his army might disappear. He needed a victory. Not someday, not in the spring. Now. The retreat also tested public faith. Men who had celebrated independence in July now saw the army falling back in December. Farmers had to decide whether to help Washington, sell to British foragers, hide supplies, or wait to see who would win. Local committees tried to maintain patriot authority, but military reality had a way of weakening political language. Paine's American Crisis was read to troops in this atmosphere. Its opening line endured because it refused to pretend the moment was easy. A summer soldier and sunshine patriot, Paine warned, would shrink from service in crisis. The line cut because everyone knew crisis had arrived. Washington's decision to strike was therefore more than a battlefield calculation. It was an attempt to interrupt a story of collapse. If the year ended with retreat and expiring enlistments, the army might fade away. If it ended with a victory, even a small one, the revolution might breathe again. Washington chose Trenton. The town was held by Hessian troops under Colonel Johann Rall. Hessians were German auxiliaries hired by Britain, disciplined soldiers whose presence became a patriot propaganda gift. To many Americans, foreign troops fighting for the king made the war feel even harsher. Washington's plan was dangerous. On Christmas night 1776, his force would cross the Delaware River from Pennsylvania into New Jersey, march through freezing weather, and strike Trenton before dawn. The river was filled with ice, the weather was brutal. Snow, sleet, wind, and darkness slowed everything. Men struggled into boats, artillery had to be moved, horses, guns, and soldiers crossed in miserable conditions. Some planned crossings by other American forces failed. Washington's column was delayed, but it crossed. The march to Trenton was punishing. Men moved through cold roads in the dark. Some lacked proper shoes. Blood on snow became part of later memory because it captured the physical cost of the campaign, whether every detail of the image was literal for every man or not. Washington pressed on. Surprise was still possible. At Trenton on the morning of December 26th, the Americans attacked. The crossing has become one of the most painted and mythologized scenes in American memory. But beneath the legend was a practical nightmare. Boats had to carry men who were exhausted before the march began. Artillery had to be moved through ice. Officers had to keep units together in darkness. Any serious delay could ruin surprise. Any panic could strand men on the wrong side of the river. Washington's army did not cross because victory was likely. It crossed because the alternative was slow dissolution. That is what gives the moment its force. The men were not marching from strength. They were marching because weakness left them no safer choice. When they reached the New Jersey side, the weather did not improve. The march to Trenton became a test of endurance before it became a battle. Muskets, powder, hands, feet, horses, wheels, and nerves all had to survive the night. The Battle of Trenton was short, decisive, and psychologically enormous. American forces entered the town from more than one direction. The Hessians were surprised, though not simply drunk and helpless as legend sometimes suggests. They fought, tried to organize, and came under pressure from American artillery and infantry. Colonel Johann Rall was mortally wounded. Hessian resistance collapsed. Nearly 1,000 prisoners were taken. American casualties were light compared with the scale of the victory. Militarily, Trenton did not destroy the British army. It did not end the war. It did not capture New York or secure independence. But emotionally, it changed everything. The army that had been retreating for months had struck back. Washington had shown that he could act with boldness when caution alone would mean death. The victory gave men a reason to stay. It gave supporters a reason to believe. It gave wavering civilians a reason to reconsider. After Trenton, Washington withdrew back across the Delaware with prisoners and captured supplies. But he did not stop thinking offensively. The British would respond. Cornwallis would move. The campaign was not over. Washington had bought time, morale, and possibility. In the final days of 1776 and the first days of 1777, he would use them. Trenton also altered Washington's relationship with his own men. Enlistments were still a crisis, and the army still needed soldiers to remain beyond their terms. Victory gave him an argument no speech alone could provide. The cause had not died. The army could still surprise the enemy. The commander who had retreated for months could still strike. The Hessian prisoners became visible proof. They were marched away as evidence that the British war machine could be touched, beaten, and embarrassed. In taverns, towns, and committees, the news moved faster than official reports. A victory at the end of a catastrophic year carried more emotional weight than a larger victory might have carried in easier times. British commanders now had to respond to a changed situation. The rebels were not simply dissolving. Washington was still dangerous. Strictly speaking, Princeton belongs to 1777. But historically, it is the closing blow of the 1776 crisis. After Trenton, Cornwallis moved toward Washington. On January 2, 1777, British and American forces faced each other near Trenton along Assunpink Creek. Cornwallis believed he could finish Washington the next day. Washington did not wait. During the night, he left fires burning to deceive the British and moved his army around Cornwallis toward Princeton. It was the same essential instinct that had saved him at Long Island. When trapped, preserve the army through movement. At Princeton on January 3rd, American forces fought British troops in a sharp engagement. General Hugh Mercer was mortally wounded. At a critical moment, Washington rode forward, exposing himself to danger and rallying men in a scene that became part of his legend. The Americans won. Princeton did not make independence secure. The war would continue for years. But together, Trenton and Princeton transformed the mood of the Revolution. A cause that had seemed close to collapse now had proof of life. The British still held New York. The Continental Army still faced shortages. Congress still needed money, supplies, allies, and endurance. But the army had survived the worst moment of 1776, and survival was everything. Princeton also showed Washington's growing preference for movement over static defense. He did not defeat Cornwallis by standing still and accepting the obvious fight. He slipped away, struck elsewhere, and forced the British to rethink the campaign. It was not the warfare of grand European conquest. It was a war of survival, morale, timing, and refusing the enemy a final blow. After Princeton, the British pulled back toward New Brunswick. Washington moved his army into winter positions around Morristown. The Revolution had not been saved forever, but it had been saved for the moment. That was enough. The psychological distance from December to January was enormous. In December, independence seemed like a declaration without an army. After Trenton and Princeton, it seemed like a cause that could suffer disaster and still answer. 1776 is easy to simplify. It is easy to remember only July 4th, only the declaration, only the ringing words and the imagined certainty of a new nation. But the real 1776 is more powerful because it was not certain. The same year that gave America independence also gave it humiliation, retreat, panic, occupation, and near collapse. The same commander who forced the British out of Boston misjudged New York and lost city after city. The same Congress that declared universal principles struggled within a world of slavery, exclusion, fear, and divided loyalties. The Revolution survived because its leaders and soldiers kept moving through contradiction. Paine gave the cause language. Jefferson gave it a declaration. Congress gave it political form. Knox's guns freed Boston. Washington's army lost New York but escaped destruction. Glover's sailors carried men through fog. Soldiers whose enlistments were ending crossed an icy river because the alternative was surrender by exhaustion. By the end of 1776, independence existed on paper. After Trenton and Princeton, it also had a pulse. The next year would bring a different test. In 1777, British strategy would aim to cut New England from the rest of the states. Philadelphia would fall. Saratoga would change the war. France would begin to matter in a new way. But all of that depended on one thing first. The Revolution had to survive 1776. And it did. That survival is why 1776 still matters beyond the parchment. A declaration can announce a principle, but people have to carry that principle through fear, hunger, bad roads, bad weather, bad news, and bad odds. The Revolution's second year proved that America's founding was not a single moment of eloquence. It was a sequence of decisions made when failure looked reasonable. The story did not end with fireworks. It ended with exhausted soldiers in winter quarters, British forces still powerful, Congress still struggling, and Washington still trying to hold together an army that was always one crisis away from dissolution. But the army existed, and because it existed, the Declaration still had a defender.